This is a concentration camp. These people are Jews. You know their story. You've seen it in movies, read about it in books, talked about it in school. One of the Jews who survived these conditions were a psychologist by the name of Viktor Frankl. Survival in the concentration camps was a nightmarish challenge. Frankl saw this with his own eyes, that the Jews who had a reason to survive had a higher survival rate compared with the Jews who had better access to food. Those who had a why to live were better equipped for survival than those who were equipped with food. On the other side of the world, at the same time as the Jews were suffering in the concentration camps, Japan had an ongoing war with multiple nations at once. After almost a decade of war, the tide was turning against the Japanese. December 26, 1944, Hiro Onoda, a lieutenant, was deployed to the small islands of Lubang in the Philippines. By this time, the US had planned to aid the government of the Philippines in their war against the Japanese. Onoda was ordered to slow the progress of the US Army as much as possible and to never surrender, whatever the circumstances may be. And then February 1945 came, and the Americans, as they usually do, took the island of Lubang almost immediately after their arrival. The Japanese soldiers didn't stand a chance, and within days of the United States' arrival, all but Onoda and 3 of his men were dead. From this point on, Onoda and his men took to the mountains, where they started a guerrilla warfare campaign. As we all know, the United States, with Oppenheimer in their ranks, dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan in August 1945, and consequently, Japan had to surrender. Onoda was completely unaware of this, so he and his men continued to disrupt the peace on the island of Lubang. The US military dropped leaflets around Lubang. The leaflets contained written information about Japan's surrender. Onoda and his men, however, did not believe this information and thus continued with their warfare activities. 7 years passed. By this time, the spreading of leaflets had stopped long ago, and most of the American army had left the island. The Japanese government made one final effort to draw the last remaining soldiers out of hiding, where they spread letters and pictures from the soldiers' families. Onoda saw this as a trap, just like the leaflets, and ignored this information as well. By 1959, one of Onoda's companions had surrendered. Another had been killed by the locals on the island, who were sick of being terrorized by ghost soldiers in the woods. Onoda was left with only one fellow soldier, called Kozuka, who also ended up dying 10 years later in 1969. Now he was alone, fighting a world war by himself against an enemy that didn't even exist. Things turned from this point on. Kozuka's death shocked the Japanese population. People started to entertain the idea that maybe Onoda was still alive on the island. The government of Japan and the Philippines sent search parties to look for Onoda in the jungle, but they were unsuccessful. The story of Onoda morphed into something of an urban legend in Japan. He was the war hero who sounded too insane to even exist. By chance, an adventurer called Suzuki, who had dropped out of school to hitchhike his way across Asia, fancied himself to be the one who were going to find Onoda, unarmed and untrained for any type of combat. Suzuki traveled to Lubang and began wandering around the jungle all by himself. His strategy? Scream Onoda's name really loudly and tell him that the emperor was worried about him. He found Onoda in just 4 days. Suzuki ended up staying with Onoda for some time, and at one point asked him why Onoda never left the island. Onoda's response was that he was simply following an order, which was to never surrender. Humans often choose to dedicate large portions of their lives to seemingly useless and destructive causes. On the surface, these causes make no sense. It is hard to imagine how Onoda could have been happy on that island for those 30 years, living off insects and rodents, sleeping in the dirt and murdering civilians. Yet, later in his life, he said that he regretted nothing. The key is that Onoda chose how he wished to suffer. His suffering meant something. It was for a greater cause, albeit a false one, from an objective point of view. Because his suffering meant something, he was capable of enduring it, and at times even enjoying it. And here comes the irony. Onoda returned to Japan in 1974 and became a kind of celebrity in his home country he fought so hard for. He was given fame, respect, and even earned a sizable amount of money after publishing a book. But what he found when he returned to Japan horrified him. A consumerist, capitalist, superficial culture that had lost all of the traditions of honor and sacrifice upon which generations had been raised. Onoda did his best to use his influence to advocate for the values of old Japan, but nobody could take him seriously. He was tone deaf to the new generation, influenced by the United States, the very nation that made him hide in the jungle for 3 decades. As a consequence, he became far more depressed than he had ever been in the jungle for all those years. In the jungle, his suffering meant something. He had a why for his suffering. But back in Japan, he was confronted with an ugly truth, that his fighting truly had meant nothing. If you want to support this channel, I would highly appreciate it if you liked and subscribed.